Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you, Ben, for that kind introduction. I'd like to thank Columbia and the Veritas Forum for the invitation, and all of you for coming out this evening. In a way, I think I'm a peculiar person to be speaking about secularism in the academy, in large part, because I consider the secular a myth, and I consider it a metaphysical impossibility. The notion of the secular assumes that there is an area of life from which God is absent, and since I don't actually believe that, the secular seems to me to be an illusion. It's a useful illusion. It lets us do some interesting things, but an illusion is what it is. It's also very hard to define what we mean when we say the secular. Charles Taylor, in his book on a secular age, offers several different definitions. He says he's going to offer two, then he offers a third one, and then he offers a fourth one. And I want to mention only two of the four definitions that appear in the book, the two that seem most useful when we're thinking about campus life. One of the definitions, he says, one way of thinking about the idea of the secular is we're thinking about a particular set of institutions and institutional practices, a particular way of doing business, a particular way of organizing not only public life, but the life of institutions as well, and in particular organizing them in a way, as Taylor might put it, that it doesn't really make much difference whether there's a God or not. That's one way to think about it. Another one of his definitions, which I also find fascinating, is to think of the secular in a historical context, the climax, he says, of a 500-year progression from an era in the West in which it was thought very unusual not to believe in God, in which belief in that sense was the default, to an era in which it's thought increasingly unusual to believe in God. That is, not believing in God is the default. And I think that those two definitions together capture what most people, whatever their position may be on the issues, think about when they think about secularism in the classroom, in the university, in the academy generally. I was asked to talk a little about my own experience, and my own experience is perhaps well captured in a conversation I had with a colleague of mine a couple of years ago. I was having lunch with a colleague who writes a lot about issues regarding both not only law and religion, but also religion as narrative and some similar issues. And he told me that he had heard from another colleague that I had turned down an invitation to write for a leading theological journal after the journal sent along their editorial guidelines. And I said that was true. And he said, what did you object to in the editorial guidelines? And he said the editorial guidelines said that you cannot use gendered pronouns to refer to God. And he asked why that bothered me. And I said, because of the way in which I believe God chose to reveal himself. It's not a matter of God possessing gender, but rather a matter of revelation. And so we had a conversation about that. And he said to me, don't you feel, though, that with that point of view, that keeps you out of some circles of discussion you could otherwise be in? And I think it's actually not true. It's the rules of those circles that sometimes will keep me out of discussions I might otherwise be in. I gave a talk about just war theory at Northwestern Law School a few years ago. They had a lecture series there, and I was giving these lectures. And at the dinner after one of the lectures, one of the professors asked me, how would your talk have been different if you were not a Christian? And I'd never considered that, and I gave him the only honest answer I could, which was that I have no idea. that I don't know the answer. I wouldn't begin to understand how to construct an answer to that question. I am what I am. One of my colleagues, one of my good friends, Bruce Ackerman, is fond of calling me a conversational anarchist. And what he means by that, and I take it as a compliment, you understand, is that there's all this work going on in the academy, in political philosophy and elsewhere, to try to devise a public space which will begin with a certain set of principles in which none of us have to worry about any preconceived notions. We can come up with a common language that we can speak. And it's true, this common language includes biases and prejudices like, religion and nasty stuff like that, but it has all the good stuff in it. It has a lot of good liberal virtues and so on and so on. And I don't believe any of that. My view as a conversational anarchist is you come into the public space or the private space or the space in which you find yourself when you speak in the language that you're most comfortable with, and if nobody wants to listen because they don't agree with your starting point, then you lose. You should have come up with a better argument. Sometimes you just lose. But sometimes you win. Sometimes you win. One of my favorite stories I tell to my students all the time involves one of the leading figures of the civil rights movement, Fannie Lou Hamer. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer, I assume many of you know who she is. If you don't know who she is, Fannie Lou Hamer was a nearly illiterate black woman. She was a sharecropper who in the 1960s became the inspiration and leading light of what was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. At this time in the South, as you would well imagine, the Democratic Party was segregated, which is to say it was a lily-white party. Now, the story takes place in 1964. Now, what I understand about 1964, remember that John Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Lyndon Johnson became president. And Johnson was determined in 1964 to win by a landslide to show that he wasn't just Kennedy's vice president, to earn his place on his own terms. There was only one little problem. In order to do that, he wanted a very smooth Democratic convention. It's as though he could look forward to what was going to happen in 1968. The problem with his desire for a smooth Democratic convention is that, as I said, all these lily-white delegations came from the southern states, and yes, they were all going to vote for him to be nominated for president, but the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party sent an integrated slate of delegates from Mississippi, and they wanted to have a floor fight to force the Democratic Party onto the record as to which slate it would seat. And this was the last thing Johnson wanted or needed in 1964. A floor fight would be exactly what could drive Southern voters away. Now, if you don't know, I should explain that at that time, when a president was assassinated and the vice president took over, there was no provision for a vice president. So there was no vice president of the United States in 1964. But everyone expected the running mate to be Hubert Humphrey. And so Johnson came up with a test, as it were, for Hubert Humphrey. And what happened was this. The Democratic Convention was in Atlantic City. And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party arrived en masse in Atlantic City. And Johnson says to Humphrey, in effect, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, he says, go figure out what that woman, Fannie Lou Hamer, what that woman really wants and give it to her so she'll avoid, you see, a floor fight. So there's a famous story, it's told in a number of history books in slightly different ways, but on these details everyone agrees. They met in a hotel room in Atlantic City, Humphrey and his staff, Fannie Lou Hamer and the leaders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and they sat and they chatted for a while. And finally Humphrey said to her, Mrs. Hamer, please, I'm asking in the president's name, what do you really want? And Mrs. Hamer looked at him and she said, Mr. Humphrey, what I really want is the immediate establishment of God's kingdom here on earth. That was not one of the things that Lyndon Johnson empowered Humphrey to grant. So Humphrey said to her, but Mrs. Hamer, you know I'm a great friend of your people. I'm a great friend of civil rights, and that was true. Humphrey gave the famous 1948 pro-civil rights speech that people were afraid was going to sink the Democratic Party then. He said, you know, if we can't make a deal here today, I may not be vice president, and you could have no greater friend in the White House than Hubert Humphrey. And Mrs. Hamer looked at him and said, you know, Senator, I lost my job too for doing the right thing. Said, if you do the right thing, God will take care of you. She said, I'll pray for you. And that was the end of the negotiation. Now, the thing you have to understand about this story is that, to me, the hero is Fannie Lou Hamer, who stuck to her guns, who felt no particular need to disguise what she wanted in order to win the negotiation or to translate it into some common language. She spoke the truth as she understood the truth. That, to me, is what is masked when people say, well, really, we ought to come up with a conversational style in which we all sound exactly the same and we don't begin from all these different starting points. My view, my very strongly held view of the separation of church and state is that, aside from the fact, which we can get into in the Q&A session, that it plainly exists to protect the church from the state and not the other way around, but my strongly held view is that it has been throughout history probably the single greatest source of pluralism and diversity in American democracy. It's precisely these differences over fundamental questions that make the democracy vibrant, that make our arguments deep. It is true, when people begin from sharply different premises, sometimes the arguments that ensue are enormously uncomfortable. And sometimes people on either side of any divide get unnecessarily vicious and mean-spirited and intolerant. But that's not because they start from different starting points. That's because we're humans and we're mortal and we're weak and we're sinful, and when tempted, we often are going to let the other fella have it. That's just the way we are. The ability to begin from these different starting points and to look at each other as fellow humans, as equally loved by God across these different starting points, is precisely what ought to give democracy its great power. What frightens me sometimes and worries me a lot about the academy is a sense there ought to be a kind of leveling of conversation, a very narrow set of points from which we begin, and that narrowing doesn't really create a common dialogue. It creates a dialogue from which a lot of people are excluded. It may be that there are people in some institutions, secular as well as religious, who would prefer a dialogue from which certain voices were excluded, but it's not my vision of democracy or of deep and genuine conversation. What makes conversation and dialogue, what we're talking about tonight, what makes it both valuable and real, is our ability to be genuine, to talk about what's really on our minds, and importantly, where it really comes from. And sometimes that causes confusion, sometimes it causes a lot of anguish, and sometimes it causes us not to be able to agree. But I would much rather have us be unable to agree when we're being honest than agree with each other when we're really all lying. I think I should stop there and take the 15 minutes or half an hour, whatever it is, of questions. Thank you.
There, you offered two definitions of secularism that answer one of the first questions that I was going to ask, was whether secularism is a technique, an intellectual posture, or a truth claim. But and you said essentially it's both. It depends on your definition. But what I'm really curious about is, at a very practical level, is the operation of secularism at the university. Because for students, especially for undergraduates, it's not just a theory. It actually functions in the classroom. So pretend that you are, for the sake of those who maybe are not affiliated with the university, or how does secularism operate at a practical level in the university today? How do you become aware of the fact that secularism is a dominant theory?
Well, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that. There may be people sitting in the audience who are better at it than I. I mean, I sit on my side of the lectern, plus I have tenure, so I can say pretty much anything I want and ignore pretty much anything that I want. I will tell you a couple of brief stories, well, maybe one brief story of what students have said about, but I'd be very interested in hearing what people here might have to say about it. I had a student, 5 or 6 years ago, a young man who was at Yale, who had gone to a Christian college. And he was, I don't want to say bitter, but he was frustrated, I think. It was hard to track down the frustration, but basically what he told me, what was on his mind, wasn't about the conversation, it was about the teaching, that he felt that there were a number of professors who made remarks that he thought were casually either, well, in his case, anti-Christian, but anti-religion in general. There was a mockery of religious belief from behind the lectern. I don't pretend to know how much that actually happens. I read articles that assert that it happens all the time. I can't say for sure that it happens all the time. I do think that there is, quite apart from any question of mockery, again, if you go back to questions, if you're taking an introductory course in philosophy, particularly political or moral philosophy, one of the first things that you'll talk about is starting points for argument, especially if it's a moral philosophy course. And you might be talking about the background in the Wittgensteinian sense, or you might be talking about some notion of finding a common starting point. You might be reading Rawls or Nagel or one of the others who tries to design this public space, and that work is taken very seriously in the philosophy classroom. But apart from that, my best sense of this whole thing as a member, I can't say as a student, but as a member of a faculty, is captured in stories like the one that I told you. And here's one way I like to think about it. We have categories that have been developed through the practice of what I guess we could call secular argument. Discrimination is a good example of the category. So suppose that someone who's not a Catholic, and I'm not, looks at the Catholic Church and says, well, they discriminate against women because women can't be priests and so on. Now, that's the effort to take a category developed for a particular secular purpose and impose it on a religious organization that begins from a very different set of premises. Now, their premises may not be my premises, but the notion that this category should be or could be all-encompassing, that somehow it's vital that there be no worldviews that have anything different to say, even within a religious community, I think it's actually very dangerous. And people say, well, and this is an argument I've written about, and people say, well, what if it were race? And the answer is, if it's race, well, I'm thinking of the Bob Jones case, which many people here may not remember, but the Bob Jones case was, 20 years ago? Something like that. More, 30 years ago. In the Bob Jones case in the 1980s, the Supreme Court upheld the denial of at least a significant part of the tax exemption of Bob Jones University, which, among other things, didn't allow interracial dating and various other things like that. Now, I wouldn't want to go to Bob Jones University then, or probably now, but it wasn't clear to me that the sky is going to fall if they're able to have their little campus and do their little preaching in that little corner. Now, if that were 25% of the universities in the United States, would that be a problem? It would be a gigantic problem. If it's 2 college and universities out of, at that time, about 1,050 four-year colleges, we're a little down from that now, I'm not sure the problem is so large that we have to worry about it in quite the same way if they're off in their corner doing their religion the way that they do it. I think that Now, I could be wrong about either one of those cases, but I think that pockets of resistance, people who see the world very differently, are important. It's important to have that tension. Having said that, all of us should be able to draw lines. That is to say, it's not a secular versus religious thing to say that there are some beliefs that should be off the table, that history is shown to be so terribly devastating and so terribly harmful that they get no respect. The important thing is that that list be a short one for each of us. One of the things that worries me, for example, about politics today is how many people have 38 different issues on which they think that all of the views should be off the table. That's where I think you run into problems.
Great. Character as a pluralistic universities where religious expression is welcome. But do you think that some would say that religion is categorized as a certain facet of your identity, your culture, your background that's outside the realm of reason, or it's not subject to an intellectual process? Would you say that that's an accurate depiction, or is...
I'd like to break the question into at least two parts. That is, on the first part, are there a lot of religious organizations and groups on campuses? Happily, yes. I mean, this is obviously this is a good thing if you believe in diversity. If you don't believe, to the extent one thinks everyone should think the same, it's a bad thing, but diversity is a good thing. And the diversity in religions is a good thing. There was a time, not that long ago, when they would all have been various Christian groups, and there was a time not long before that, there's a time in living memory when, for a lot of colleges, there had been very little need for particular campus ministries. Well, living memory of someone my age, not for your living memory, but because everyone would have been not only Christian, but very likely, depending on what school you were at, there would have been some subset of the same Christians. So you look at Yale University, the number of Catholics, for example, on campus as recently as the 1950s, it's quite minute. And intentionally kept minute. So this diversity is a good and wonderful thing. But the question of what you are free to be is an entirely different question to whether there exists, as many insist, a subtle pressure to be something else instead, or some particular variety of what it is you're free to be. And a good example of this, again, came up at Yale College this time a few years ago. Well, this is a good 10 or 15 years ago now. It made the papers all over the country. The New York Times ran several articles about it. This was the so-called Yale 7, the 6, I guess, ended up being the Orthodox Jewish students who, as freshmen, wanted not to live in the dorms as Yale requires, because they believed that the atmosphere itself in the dorms was one that promoted premarital sex, which they thought was wrong. Now, when we say wrong, they weren't trying to persuade anybody to live any different way than they wanted to live. They just didn't want to be in a place that they felt would pressure them to live in a particular way that's different from what was of first importance. And what was really interesting about that experience is how badly the university misunderstood the complaint. So badly that one of the deans at Yale College, who was involved in the failed negotiations, the effort to avoid litigation in the case, said, it's in the transcript, you can find it, it's in the transcript of one of the meetings, one of the deans said, I don't understand why they don't want to live in the dorms. If they think that people norms are wrong, they should want to live there so they can change their minds, which was a remarkable failure to understand their sense. What they want to do is be free to live a particular way without feeling the pressures of others who wanted them to live a particular way. This was litigated at a school in the Midwest, I think the University of Nebraska, I don't remember now after all these years, which actually had some sort of Christian theme house on campus. And some of the freshmen were also required to live on campus there, and the freshmen wanted to live in the theme house, where apparently, and I wasn't involved in this case. Now, I was a little bit involved in the Yale case. I wasn't involved in that one. But in the theme house, the idea was that they would preserve a certain vision that they thought of being chaste and so on. And they felt if they lived in the dorms, the pressure would be the other way. And the university resisted. Again, they said the rule is you've got to live in the dorms when you're a freshman, and that was actually litigated on First Amendment grounds, although that case was ultimately settled. I think that in that half of the question, that there's a difference then between the notion that you're free to believe and be as you like, and the notion that but we would prefer that you be this way within a particular model of what people should be. And now I forgot the second half of the question. I'm getting old.
That's okay. Well, what you said actually brings up another question, related question I had. So Andrew Delbanco is a highly esteemed professor here who recently published a book entitled College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be. And a central theme of the book is that early American colleges back in the 17 and 1800s created space for students to ask the big questions of life, while our present emphasis on career preparation is crowding out those kinds of questions. Now, when you were talking about religion just now, the question was whether or not an individual student would be allowed to be or to express their religion as an individual expression of their identity or their beliefs. But is there something about secularism or about the rules of the academy that also make it uncomfortable? You said, for instance, in the students' defense, they weren't trying to persuade anybody to live any differently. But shouldn't they be allowed to persuade somebody to live differently? And should you be allowed to persuade somebody to believe differently? Because this is touching on a subject that's very un-PC, and that would be even the word conversion. Conversion is something that is imposed upon other people, supposedly. But that implies that the person never actually can make a choice to change their beliefs. It's an immutable part of your identity. Now, do you think that beliefs should be part of the academic discussion, and with the possibility even that somebody might choose as a result of a discussion to change?
See, this time I wrote down both halves of the question so I wouldn't forget. As to the first, on the issue of careerism and so on, I would have only limited sympathy for a person of deep religious faith who said, this place is so careerist, it's contrary, because in law we have the concept of coming to the nuisance. It's not as though you can go to Columbia and think, I'm going to a place where people sit around reflecting on the big questions all the time and never worry about whether they're going to get in law school or medical school or something like that. It's just not realistic. And it's a tragedy in a way of our world that we don't make space for reflection on the big questions. One of my favorite essays is Bertrand Russell's essay written about 100 years ago, about 80 years ago, entitled In Praise of Idleness. And in the essay, Bertrand Russell says we all need time to be idle. When he says idle, he makes clear he means doing nothing, not reading, not studying, just sitting or walking and thinking. He says if we don't take times of complete idleness, we can never really reflect. And if we don't reflect, we can never really have any views of our own. We can only respond to other people's ideas. I think he's absolutely right. And I think to the extent that the academic life has become so intense that people have to work so hard, there's no room for reflection, we're failing our students and failing them very badly. Now, having said that, I'd like to believe that if there were time for reflection, that students would be reflecting as opposed to the various other things that people fill their time with, whether they're things intimate or things online or whatever they may be. The act of reflecting, of spending time letting the mind run free, I think is a crucial part of discovering truth. Now, on the issue of persuasion, we argue about all kinds of things on campus. People try to change each other's minds about politics and so on. So the interesting question is then, why do we feel differently when people try to change our minds about religion? I think it's because it's for exactly the reason that I was talking about at the lectern, that at least for people to whom religion is important, that the narrative of our relationship to God in which we find ourselves is partly constitutive of who we are. So to try to change that, to say, your narrative is not as good as my narrative, or you should think about my narrative instead, can be enormously threatening. So it's easy to understand the tension that it causes. On the other hand, especially the way things are nowadays, there are plenty of people whose narratives are entirely and intensely partisan, and who feel just as threatened if you disagree with them on abortion, say, or if it's perhaps someone who is pro-life, or say global warming, if it's someone who's liberal and so on, that there is an intensity of response that is very similar to that same concern about identity. And I know that there are critics who disbelieve the MRI studies that claim to show that for intensely political people, when they encounter political arguments, the reasoning part of their brain stay almost completely untouched, and they respond almost entirely to the emotional part of their brains. And other people don't believe that those studies are true, but they do seem consistent with experience. It is very threatening. Now, is it worse to criticize or to try to persuade someone out of their religion than it is to persuade them out of their politics, or to, I don't know if it's worse. I do think this. I do think that to the extent, if you and I are having an argument about politics and we disagree, and I'm arguing in a way that makes you furious, the one thing I know for sure is I'm not going to win the argument. And I think the same is true of any discussion about religion. That is, if we're going to have a discussion about our religious beliefs and they're different, it ought to be a discussion. It ought to be a conversation. It's hard for me when it teaches law students to say this, but I'm always emphasizing that it's important for us to listen with our ears. We're in a community where we're in a culture where we tend to listen with our mouths, where the listening is attuned entirely to when is he going to shut up so I can have my say. And that's not real communication. I've always thought that if we disagree, and I want you to give me a genuine opportunity to persuade me, I need to give you, if I want you to give me a genuine opportunity to persuade you, I need to give you a genuine opportunity to persuade me as well. And I think that lots and lots of times, there are people of religious faith who come into dialogue with people who disagree with them in ways that are entirely the opposite of that. And because that model is seen so frequently, a lot of people bristle at the very idea of religion in the discussion because they think it's going to be that way because it's been that way so many times. That's the fault. You can't blame the secular university or a secularized culture for that. That's the fault of people of faith.
Okay, so that brings up another theme in your writing as well, and that would be civility as a model for the public square, as a way of having a communication, instead of controlling the public discourse by limiting certain topics, you actually hold up an ideal for a way of talking about certain topics. And so maybe we could, rather than talking about civility, perhaps model it, and I will ask you to tell me why you have found Christianity to be persuasive or satisfying or fulfilling. One of the things that we do in the Veritas Forum is actually flesh out people's worldviews and perspectives and do so in a way that's civil and conversant in that way. So why have you found Christianity compelling, and is it just part of your identity and your culture, or is there an intellectual facet to it in a way in which it's been persuasive to you?
It's funny, you use two different words and they're not at all the same. One is compelling and one is fulfilling. And there are very different ways of looking at religious commitment, including my own religious commitment. There's I'm blanking on who wrote this famous essay about, I think it was Luther, who wrote this essay in which he talked about people who pray for that their failing business will succeed. I think it was Luther. Maybe someone who knows this literature better can correct me. I think it was Luther who wrote this essay in which he talked about how if your business is failing, and it's clearly going to fail, and you're praying for it to succeed, that's idolatry, he said. And the reason he said it was idolatry was precisely that he was trying to explain that religion is not there to fulfill you. Religion is, at least Christianity said, is duty. It's not there to make you feel better. It's there to help you do the right thing. My dear friend Stanley Hauerwas, one of the great living theologians, is fond of writing that he says, people always say, I should be free to make up my own mind about that. But as a Christian, he said, I know that it's not my mind to make up. It doesn't belong to me. I start out that way, I guess, because although a part of my commitment is certainly emotional, a lot of it is also rational. And I mean rational in two senses. I mean rational in the sense that here I have the C.S. Lewis idea in mind, that it's I actually find the Christian narrative persuasive and likely to be true, even if you believe it in the sense of some of the 19th century Christian historicists whose view was, well, it seems at least provisionally true until it's disproved, but it seems to be likely to be true, but also rational in the sense that there have been centuries of effort by Christian theologians and Christian preachers to understand and explain the world and the relationship of men and women in the world to God. And I find that narrative persuasive. Now, others may not, but I'm not trying to tell others what they must believe. I'm trying to say what I must believe. And then once that door is opened, then I follow, and I'll mention one more theologian, then I'll stop. Someone like John Milbank, who would say that if you're a Christian in the academy, if you're a professor, that whatever your field may be, you must know the theology in the field, or at least be conversant with it if you're not expert in it. Because for the Christian who is also in the academy, he argues theology has to come first among the academic disciplines. I actually believe that. Now, does that so I teach contracts, I teach evidence, I teach the ethics of war, I teach some other subjects. Does that mean that when I teach contracts, I'm talking about what Aquinas said about contract law? And he did talk about contracts and promises. No, but that background may influence my thinking about it. On the other hand, I have to admit that when I do just war, which I write about a lot, and I teach about a lot, I tell those notes on the first day. No one has done a better job, at least the literatures I'm familiar with on this, than the Christian theologians who have been struggling with this since the discovery of the New World. I mean, earlier, but really struggling since the discovery of the New World and the horrific treatment of native people in the New World, which made the theologians first in Barcelona and then elsewhere rethink are there duties that are owed and so on, and that began to lead to a flowering of just war thinking that still goes on. That's where the richest literature is. That's where the great majority of our so-called secular just war traditions come from, and that's where most of international law, at least in its basics, comes from, at least the law of war, as well. So there it turns out that by being conversant with the theology, I'm also conversant with the subject matter in ways that are useful. Elsewhere, I still don't have the answer to the question of what would be different, say, if I didn't think this way or read these things. One more point. You asked me about civility. Maybe it's what Christianity teaches, maybe it's just what my mother taught me. I don't know, or maybe it's both. I really, really deeply believe that I am not a good enough person to hate you for what you believe. I'm not good enough. I'm too sinful myself to look at you and say, since we disagree, there's something wrong with you. And it frightens me. I can use that word again. It does. It frightens me a lot and also depresses me to look at the extent to which so much of politics today is based on exactly the things that liberals of the 60s and 70s said had no place in politics. And by that I mean, well, speaking of Columbia, I mean the list of things Richard Hofstadter talked about. Applause lines, emotional appeals, slogans, lists of people to hate. Applause lines, emotional appeals, slogans, lists of people to hate. That was exactly, he said, what causes politics to be reactionary. Reactionary for him was not necessarily the ends sought, but the means. I'm not saying I don't think ends are important. Of course they are. But the means matter too. They matter to me as a Christian. They matter to me as an American citizen. They should matter to all of us. And because of the golden rule, I cannot follow the line that says, well, since you made a nasty crack about me, I'll give a nasty crack back. My raising wasn't treat you the way you treat me, but treat you as I would have you treat me. And there, I haven't been able to find a way to interact differently. The spirit of the current age of how one does political argument is a spirit I have no way to enter, no way to join into, which is why for me, you talked about that politics itself, into a sense of partisan politics, has become foreign and dangerous territory for me.
Now, early on in the conversation, I want to bring the conversation back to secularism and maybe ask 2 or 3 questions before we go to audience Q&A. But early on in the conversation, you made reference to the fact that where you are in the law school, you don't know what the atmosphere is like in the classrooms elsewhere in the university, and you hear stories or read reports. And I'm going to read to you excerpts from an opinion piece that a Columbia College student wrote a few years back. This was a senior in the college, somebody who must have been near the top of his class because he won a major prize nearing graduation for postgraduate work, and was active frequently cited in the college newspaper. So as a senior, he begins the piece by talking about the 2,700 Columbia students who went to psych services looking for help. And he hypothesizes that many of them may have gone there because they shared the feeling that Summer, a character in the television program The OC, put it, life is, well, random, unfair, and ultimately meaningless. And he goes on to say, existential dread is a powerful force in many undergraduate lives, partly because of a belief that runs underneath much of Columbia's intellectual life, and this belief is precisely a denial of belief. He cites a couple of sources, intellectuals who say that basically attest to that, and he says among intellectuals, disbelief has become almost a prerequisite for discussion. Secure in their disbelief, the best and brightest have smashed, at least to their satisfaction, the old constructs that used to give life meaning. God, country, and selfhood, among other victims, all stand revealed as delusions foisted upon us by ourselves. But everyone, he says, has had so much fun in the rubble, smashing tiny bits into even tinier ones, that nobody has yet gotten around to constructing anything new. So for now at least, we're adrift, or in preferred academic speak, we are post. And this constitutes the background, the white noise of a contemporary liberal arts education. And as Summer knows, it is depressing. And so...
It certainly sounds depressing.
What would you say to a student who came to you and said, this is my experience? How would you counsel them to adjust their framework, or what reference point could you point them to that would help them to escape this trap? As a professor, somebody who's speaking as a professor, how would you encourage them to change their perspective, and what resources would you give them?
Am I a law school professor in this hypothetical?
If you would like to be, guidance.
Well, I would reflect on the answer, so I won't be able to give a full answer now. I would just say 2 things that leapt to mind. I don't think, Actually, interesting, one of my Yale colleagues actually wrote a piece about this about 30 or 40 years ago, A fan named Arthur Leff, in one of his articles, talked about some of these very similar themes, and he suggested that if indeed all these various things are delusions, he was referring to the, the Copernican, Darwinian, and Freudian revolutions. He said, we're never going to recover, he said, from any of those things. I do think, there is a hunger for meaning that humans have, and wherever you think it comes from, the hunger is there. And when one can't find meaning in life, there is a tendency to despair. It is a very difficult time for young people who are coming along, especially when they get to college, where there was a time when college was focused in many ways. This is when colleges were much more narrow in whom they served, but they had much more sense of formation was a part of their job, was a kind of continuation of the work that had been done with people on their way to college. That doesn't happen anymore. So we have people who've been raised, who suddenly at 17 or 18, maybe 19 in some cases, are cast adrift. They've been raised by families, whether religious families, non-religious families, that nevertheless, they're suddenly on their own resources. And colleges back off enormously, except if you're in real trouble, they'll give you some help, but back off enormously from the job of providing meaning. And yet people need meaning. Meaning is how we make sense of the world in a very literal definition of the word. That existential emptiness you find in a lot of places. You find, especially throughout the West. And I think part of what makes bestsellers out of books, most of them, in my judgment, not very good ones, about the kind of the anti-God, anti-faith literature that sells so very well, is that people are, in a sense, looking for a justification for the very meaningless that they're finding at the core. The trouble is, put aside the question of whether people who seek mental health services are doing so because their lives feel empty. I don't know what the reason is, I wouldn't presume. But think of what fills in if there's not a space for transcendence. It's not a space that says there is something greater than yourself. There is something more to point to aspire to achieve. Then what fills the space? Well, what fills the space is, as you said before, careerism, this desperate search, climbing the ladder, and at each rung, a few people feel, well, I haven't really made it. We're talking about kids. We're talking about teenagers who think because they didn't get to the right college or the right law school, their lives are done. It's all over. Because there's nothing else to provide them meaning but the constancy of this climb. That's one thing that fills. The consumerism fills the void, the constant need to acquire, and find a job, the function of which is simply to provide income with which I can either acquire or have fun or some combination of the both. None of it then is fulfilling. Each step is somehow a step toward something else that I can get or desire or do without ever being fulfilled. I can't remember who it is who said that in the Victorian age, they never talked about sex, but obsessed about death. And in our age, we obsess about sex and never talk about death. But death is what we're all marching toward. That's coming, and you can't, no matter how good your diet or how hard you exercise, you can't live forever. You can't outlive death. And when we don't have any tools to think in a serious way about what's there, and you can reflect in a serious way and decide there's nothing there, as long as it's serious reflection, but we don't even undertake the reflection. We shunt it aside in climbing and careering and acquiring. We are trying to fill that hole that needs meaning, but none of that can fill it. None of that is ever going to be good enough, and so there'll be that constant search for the thing that I need to fill in that space. My view is that space is put there by God so that we will seek Him. Others may disagree with that, but there is certain that seeking space is certainly there. And if one feels, no, I'm not going to seek God, at least seek something. Let there be some goal other than the next test, the next application, the next promotion, or the next car, whatever it may be.
I think this will be the last issue or question that I will raise. That's simply, where do you go from here? What's the practical...
I'm going home.
What's the practical application? How do you do what you are suggesting in a practical sense? You can encourage an individual student in that direction, but what about the structure of the university or the way that academic discourse is structured? I think one of the observations that somebody might make is that secularism is bound up with a critical scholarship, the idea that you shouldn't ever come to conclusions, because if you ever come to a fixed conclusion, if you stop asking, if you stop probing, you're going to miss something. And I think that's what the student is actually is reflecting, in a sense, that there's a constant attacking of the myths, attacking, and showing how they really are not what they appear to be. Should there be, ought there to be a method of scholarship, again, that draws conclusions, that helps to build up meaning, and how would you encourage that?
Well, I want to defend the university for a minute. I mean, I think that's a little strong. I don't think that one can fairly describe even liberal undergraduate education as a constant shaking of the myths, a constant attacking of them, although some of that certainly goes on here and there. It's not, for lack of a better word, its function. And I'm not saying that no professors mock particular religious beliefs. I'm not saying that every professor or every classroom is equally open to them, and that's too bad. That's a bad thing. But I think that in fairness, that one has to be able to withstand critical analysis, critical thought. I'm not saying that we need to put all of our convictions up for grabs every morning. But I think that it's not reasonable to think, on the one hand, I should be free to express. On the other hand, no one should be attacking. It's just not going to work that way. I don't think that the universities, what you've described as secular universities, are ever going to become places that are strongly supportive of students in their religious belief or in their search for God and for an understanding of God. That's not going to happen. Students have to find each other, have to find campus ministries, have to find off-campus ministries, have to find other ways to engage that search, and have to find ways that are supportive with other students. The university is not going to help that. It's just not the way it's going to work. On the other hand, the appreciation, the understanding of critique and critical analysis, the understanding that there is an unfriendly world out there, is also, I think it's part of growing in a genuine conviction. It's part of what makes that creation of the tension doesn't have to be resolved in the direction of, I give up. It may be resolved in the direction of realizing that living with genuine conviction, and it's not just a religious conviction, living with any unfashionable conviction in a community where a different conviction is fashionable is really hard, And it's too bad that we place a lot of pressure on people to fit in and be part of the group. But that's what human beings do, and that's what human beings have always done. And when the church was in charge, is what the church did. It's not as though there's something new that was invented as religion began to lose its hold on public discourse. It just means it's hard. It just means it's really hard. And the important thing is for students to find each other, and frankly, to spend time also with, especially in the case of students of faith, of faculty members who they may find supportive, not in the sense of saying, oh, I'll go speak to him about what he said, but in the sense of saying everybody has these struggles and you can get through them with your faith intact. More than that, I don't think we can expect the university to offer, except for one thing, to go back to what I said at the beginning. What I still don't like the idea of trying to find some rules of the ideal neutral conversation, because each person's theory of neutrality is going to cut out of the conversation. The legal philosopher Michael Perry calls it cutting off your right arm. It's going to cut off part of the conversation. It get cut off from part of the conversation. Groups of people who will find their deepest convictions not welcome, and therefore they're not going to translate their views. They'll just be silenced entirely.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So.
I believe that people have been sending in their questions by Twitter, and they've been collected and sorted in the back, and I believe that we are going to hear from the mics some of these questions being read to Professor Carter right now.
Well, first of all, Professor Carter, I think I speak for everyone here in affirming again that we're very honored. We feel very privileged to have heard from you tonight. The first question is, referring to one of your earlier remarks, can you please clarify what you mean by saying that the separation is to protect the church from the state and not the other way around?
Yes, I can. Anything? Oh, you want me to do it? It's a long story. The simplest way to put it is this. The separation of church and state can be understood in a lot of different ways, but basically we tend to think of it either as a rule of constitutional law or as a rule of politics. If it's a rule of constitutional law, then only the state can violate it. That's the way the Constitution works. Except for the 13th Amendment, there's no provision of the Constitution that can be violated by a private person. Only the state can violate it. So that's easy. And indeed, the metaphor of separation, if you want to talk about politics, so the metaphor of separationism in American political conversation goes back, as some I'm sure know, to, well, it goes back to a lot of pre-revolutionary thought, but a lot of the pre-revolutionary thought was the thought of people like, for example, Roger Williams, people who imagined the wall of separation as a way of keeping the church from being corrupted rather than the other way around. This is actually quite important. It's more important the more you think of the United States as a secular nation. The more you believe that, the more vital it is to protect religious freedom. But religious freedom is only partly a freedom of individuals. It's a freedom really of religious communities. And I'm glad I had that question because it's finally going to let me pronounce the name of my favorite Supreme Court case, which I really like talking about, mainly because I love the name. It's a 1993 case called the Church of the Lukumi Babalu Aye versus City of Hialeah. Can I say that one more time? The Church of the Lukumi Babalu Aye versus City of Hialeah. That case involved an ordinance adopted by the City of Hialeah, purportedly forbidding the slaughter of animals. It was purportedly an animal protection ordinance. Actually, it was an ordinance that was aimed at the Church of Lukumi Babalu Aye, and that church was a church of Santeria. And if you know, I won't go into a lot of detail, but if you know the Santeria tradition, in the Santeria tradition, each of us is guided by a personal god, a personal spirit, the Orisha, and if our Orisha is nourished and powerful, we'll have good lives, and an Orisha can die if not properly nourished. And of course, the Orisha is nourished in certain ceremonies in which, among other things, animal sacrifice is practiced. It's the blood that nourishes the Orisha. These are traditions that is a fusion of certain Yoruba traditions with certain aspects of Roman Catholicism. All right. So when the church opened, the city of Hialeah adopted an ordinance forbidding the killing of animals, but it had so many exceptions that really only applied to the church. My view was, and others will disagree, my view was that even if it didn't only apply to the church, it would still have been a problem, because we have to allow a broad range of religious freedom for groups of people who are struggling to understand the relationship to God, or in the end you have no religious freedom at all. It's from that experience of trying to work out together what the Lord requires and live it that great diversity comes. We're constantly trying to flatten that diversity. It doesn't matter who's in charge, left, right, Democrats, Republicans, religious people, non-religious people. You can explain much of American history as a constant process of flattening the diversity, of trying to make sure we have fewer voices rather than more in public life. I think that's particularly dangerous. So the reason we need a separation of church and state is to protect the process through which that diversity is formed and nurtured and extended and projected into the future, which means the state can do as little regulation of the church as possible. Michael Walzer, in one of his books, The Philosopher, says this means he believes that the state can't even police the religious sphere for fraud, for example. He thinks that interferes too much with the internal operations of religion. You may want to draw the line at a different place, but my point is to have a very robust and powerful freedom of religion. And if you believe, oh no, the most important thing is to keep religious people from imposing their narrow sectarian agendas on the rest of us, then you probably think Fannie Lou Hamer was wrong, and you probably think Martin Luther King was wrong, who after all was the Reverend Martin Luther King. And if, as some revisionists say, he was actually disguising a secular agenda with a religious language, let's just say that he disguised it extremely well.
Thank you, Professor Carter, for your thoughts and insights on that question. Our next question from our audience is, how do you reconcile individual freedom to believe with religious need for community in order to fully self-realize?
How do I reconcile individual freedom to believe with the religious need for community? Well, it's interesting. That's a continuation of what I was saying a moment ago. I think that the separation of church and state there is crucial. Our freedom to pursue our own understanding of our relation with God, I think, is of first importance. In one of my books, I refer to it as the first subject of the First Amendment, which it is. And while that's, in a sense, an accident of history, it's also, I think, a crucial way of understanding the constitutional right that I actually happen to believe is the most important one, which is not to trivialize by any means any of the other ones. There are several ways that you could imagine the individual clashing with the group. One is the individual who's in a group just decides, I disagree. Well, then you can leave. And that's really important. That is, to the extent we're going to protect, as I think we should, robust spaces for religious communities to reason together and work together, we have to be absolutely sure that those communities protect exit rights. That when you have a religious community that makes it hard to exit, then you have a problem the state should be concerned with. If it's a place that's somehow going to be pulling you back, sometimes physically, which occasionally happens. It's that exit right that allows one to go off and say, you know what, I'm going to found my own, or I'm going to reason on my own, or I just don't believe any of this stuff anymore. I think it's all bunk. Now, you can get to the point where conflicting worldviews out in politics, say, and here by politics I simply mean the process of the formation of law. You can get to the point where conflicting worldviews end up with somebody's view being imposed on someone else. But if it's bad when one religious group imposed its view on someone else, which I think in most cases it is, it's also bad when most people who have secular views impose their views on someone else. I always tell my students on the first day of law school, it's a cautionary tale. I always tell them, you shouldn't advocate there should be a law on any subject, whatever it is, unless it's something over which in principle you're willing to kill. And I mean that very seriously, because if you think about it, think of the most casual law you can imagine. A law that says you have to drive on the right instead of the left. So this guy drives on the left, and he gets a ticket. He drives on the left, he gets another ticket. Drives on the left, he gets another ticket, they suspend his license. He hasn't paid any of his tickets, keeps on driving. So finally, they say, you know what, we're going to throw him in jail. Well, he doesn't want to go. He doesn't want to go. I'm not going to jail. So if you don't want to go to jail, they send these people with guns on their hips to make you go. Well, you might resist them, and if you resist them violently, they might kill you. This is a fact of law, that every law has that feature. Every law is something being imposed on someone else. That is not a reason to be against laws. I'm certainly not against them. It's a reason, I think, for us to be modest in not only be modest in our views of what we think the law should be, but also to be enormously sensitive about the notion that we tend to, each time we pass a law, we cut off some part of someone else's narrative, something else that gives their life and existence meaning. It's not a reason not to do it. Sometimes we have no choice. A lot of times we have no choice. You've got to drive on one side or the other. But it means we shouldn't dismiss as unimportant the views of those who are dissenting because of a genuine, deep-felt sense of conscience that our law is making them violate. That effect is exactly the same whether the powerful in-group that is creating or pressuring for the law happens to be religious or happens to be not religious.
So I think something that's the audience is noticing is that you've spoken about the public square in the abstract, and you've spoken about your personal worldview of your personal faith. And this is a question that sort of tries to integrate those two sides and says, do you personally believe that other religions are, quote, wrong in their worldviews, or that Christianity is the only, quote, right worldview? In other words, how do you personally approach the validity of other religious viewpoints?
Well, I'm with John Paul II on that. I think that the seeds of the word are planted in many cultures in different ways. And part of the point that John Paul II made in Crossing the Threshold of Hope is that although I am called to believe a particular thing, and I believe that it's true, I cannot say for sure that God has not called other people in other ways. That's something that's committed to God and not to me. I mean, I wish I could give you a better answer than that, but that's what I believe. And in fact, it's interesting. So it was for a long time part of small O Orthodox Christianity. Then indeed, even many non-believers might be called, provided as I can't remember who wrote that. The notion being that they did the best they could given where they were. There are a lot of that's not something that particular vision of small O is not something that would necessarily get widespread acceptance today, but it seems to me entirely plausible. I think, in fact, there's a friend of mine sitting in the audience who pointed out to me some years ago that it's really interesting when Christians say they know, because if I'm a Christian, my very belief in Jesus Christ as God's Son is a belief that arose at a time when the religious leaders thought they knew. They understood the plan. They understood God's plan. And as a Christian, I think that they were wrong, that it's say that God's plan was broader than they thought. So why isn't it possible that God's plan is broader than I can think or understand right now? That seems entirely plausible to me.
All right. Here's one of our audience who would like you to elaborate more on your interpretation and perception of the present-day public discourse in America, and asks, do you think that the current frightening state of public discourse in American politics somehow has to do with secularism? If so, how?
Does the current frightening course of discourse have to do with secularism? I think that's too hard. I mean, there have been plenty of religious eras when there have been pretty frightening discourse. I seem to remember in one of my in my evidence class last year, I read some passages from the Malleus Maleficarum, which, if you don't know what that is, was a book that was published in the 15th century to aid witch hunters in figuring out whether someone was a witch or not. It was basically rules of evidence for trials of witches. There was some pretty terrible discourse around that issue too. this will be a little bit away from the subject, but since you asked, and I'll try to be very brief. There are people who say, well, the terrible discourse has to do with television, and it does a little. It has to do with the internet, it does a little. But I think it has to do with the fact that we do politics all the time now. I think that's a part of it. That is, if you look at a lot of, so my favorite election, people always think it's the most important election. The election that was most important in American history, the 1864 presidential election, indeed I've been known to tell my students it's the only important presidential election in American history, but whether you believe that or not. So this is a time when, you're speaking of an era when one way of shutting down a speaker you didn't like, and this actually happened, is to go out, get your favorite animal, your favorite cow, kill it, drag it with a team of horses down to the lecture hall and throw it up on the stage with some friends. There was a speaker actually shut down that way. I forget what town it was in Pennsylvania in the 1860s. So we've had a lot of eras of terrible political discourse. The difference is political discourse used to cover such a small range of life. It wasn't a constant. You didn't think every day about partisan politics. You yelled and screamed at your neighbors for a few weeks, and then you went back to do, and then the election was over, went back to doing whatever it was that you did, except, of course, for that brief unpleasantness from 1861 to 1865. But other than that, that was the way, and what's happened over the years, and people have tracked this in interesting ways, is that more and more of the discourse itself has been turned over to the narrative of partisanship. So that now we live in an era in which there is no day on which we don't do partisan politics. There is no conversation about an important issue from which it's absent. And that strain, I think, creates an enormous amount of stress. Add to that what some people refer to as the echo chamber effect, that most of us listen to and read people who agree with us, so much so that one very prominent political columnist asked recently who he reads among those on the other side, said nobody, because none of them are worth reading. And I think a lot of us feel that way, behave that way. What that means is if we're surrounded by friends who agree with us, we watch only television that agrees with us, we read only op-eds that agree with us, and we read only blogs that agree with us, it's quite natural that two things will happen. One is that our own views will soon become natural and obvious because everybody knows they're true. And second, so that makes it hard for us to recognize the possibility of disagreement. But second, something worse happens, which is that since we never have to argue, our argumentative muscles get very flabby. And that flabbiness means that disagreement becomes very threatening because we don't really know how to argue back. We know how to yell and scream and call names. We're really, really good at that. The creativity that goes into some of the names that we call each other is marvelous. It's brilliant if it only went into something constructive. Imagine how far we could be ahead of where we are now. Since you asked.
Yeah, so you spoke about this dichotomy, this tension that undergraduates often feel, especially at liberal arts institutions, between these narratives that are often religious worldviews that try to provide a context of meaning and purpose, and the sense of pressure towards career and achievement, and which is often tied in with a consumeristic culture of acquiring things that make me feel happy right now. Basically, the question is, do those two spheres have anything to say to each other? Do narratives of meaning and purpose have something to add to or to contribute to a drivenness and an ambitious achieving culture?
Well, I think that they can. I think that's the important question. It's a hard one because I said, we don't listen very well. We don't like listening very much. I remember in the 1990s, one of the offices at the Vatican issued this lengthy document about exploitation of women in advertising. It's a really interesting document. It was actually very cogently argued. And I think it was Advertising Age went around and went to various advertising agencies and asked them what they thought of this document. And the response, I think, could be summarized as the Pope should stick to religion and let us do marketing, was basically the notion. I think that's the response, the automatic, off-the-cuff response of a lot of people to a lot of efforts when people try to suggest that their narrative, that their religious understanding may have something important to teach. And maybe that's appropriate. That is, that instinctive suspicion probably reduces the amount of, say, religious dominance you might otherwise be able to have. But the suspicion isn't everything. And it's important to remember, again, that religious dialogue, that is dialogue from a religious standpoint, from the view of one who is speaking out of his or her own narrative, at its worst, can indeed be divisive and frightening. There's no question. But at its best, again, for me, I think of Martin Luther King. At its best, it can cross divides. It can cross the divide among religions and between religion and non-religion. And I really believe there's a place in the human heart. Here I agree with Aquinas. There's a place inside us where in some of the really big issues, we simply, if we keep our eyes open, we simply know right from wrong. And I do believe that the particular form of dialogue that religion can be at its best can touch that place in ways that sometimes no amount of dry, reasoned argument can. I mentioned Stanley Hauerwas before, and he gives an example of this in one of his books. He says, what's wrong with murder? Why is murder wrong? And he says that if you don't believe, which you don't have to, if you don't believe that it's obviously wrong, what you think's most of us, then you have to give an argument. And he says, but once you decide it's not obviously wrong, the argument becomes really, really complex and convoluted. He goes on for several pages about the efforts of various philosophers to explain why, even if not obvious, it's wrong nevertheless. There's some things that are obviously wrong. And I actually do believe that. And they tend not to be the things that we fight about most. They tend to be the things we fight about least, because they tend to be places where across our religious divisions and across our divisions between religion and non-religion, our views over time tend to converge. Okay.
Thank you. Did you want to say, was that,
no,
did
just
you leave your remarks?
two last words, and then I'm just going to quit,
Okay.
which is, first of all, I want to thank the Veritas Forum again, and thank all of you for coming. And I just want to say that the fact that you want to come and talk about and think about these issues, much more than the fact that you wanted to listen to me, is really important, because the question about how we talk to each other, who we say we are, and who we think others are, nothing is more important to democracy or to life in the academy. So thank you all for your interest in this issue, and God bless you all. Thank you.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.